Hey guys, it's Divest. So today I wanted to talk about the story in one of my favorite video games, which just happens to be one of the most maligned and misunderstood. This video is going to have to start with a lot of context behind the Call of Duty games and the culture around them. So everyone knows what Call of Duty is, but the general consensus about the story in Call of Duty games is that they're bad. This is a really strong example of that midwit meme where the low IQ and high IQ agree on something that the majority holds the opposite opinion on. So I was 10 years old when Call of Duty went from depicting the Second World War to fictional contemporary conflicts with modern warfare. Since my brain wasn't fully developed, I loved every second of it. Then I hit puberty and became a moody teenager entering the midwit stage when Modern Warfare 2 came out 2 years later, and I started to thumb my nose at the games, probably in part because I was looking to ingrain myself with my older real-life friends who all derided Call of Duty. Then I started to like the stories for Call of Duty again once I entered into adulthood and started to act more independently. Though I don't like multiplayer as much, so the peak Call of Duty campaign for me is Infinite Warfare, which put me in the minority because I was immediately excited for the game while its reveal trailer got bombed. This trend of morons hating on good games started with Mass Effect 3, and it's only gotten worse since Infinite Warfare. What is hilarious to me is that the NPCs who engaged in this campaign have enough self-awareness to recognize that they were wrong. If you see anyone other than me talking about Infinite Warfare, after it had been out for a year or more, they're going to be discussing how they were part of the hate campaign and how they were wrong about it. Now, in the past, I said I think people who say they regret hating on Infinite Warfare should be saying it as their final words before they're executed for their crimes. My reasoning for that is because if you're a serial killer and kill a few people, then that's a personal tragedy for the victims and the families of your victims, and we think that is a good enough reason for you to be put to death. But if you were part of the hate campaign against Infinite Warfare, then you participated in the slaughter of a multi-billion-dollar franchise enjoyed by hundreds of millions of people. The end result was that the games were made worse, so you collectively harmed hundreds of millions of people. I'm actually anti-capital punishment though, and these people are getting to suffer more as they get to harvest the fruits of their slacktivism. The reason why we have media bombing campaigns now is that the only freedom most people enjoy in a modern capitalist society is their freedom to consume. They just work, pay to meet their basic needs like housing, and then they choose what to consume with the money left over. Or they talk about consuming, what video games they're going to play, what food they're going to DoorDash, whether they're going to watch Netflix or anime. The end result is that the only collective power they can muster is when they're talking about consuming with other consumers. They get a whiff of collectivism and the strength of the many. Like hitting a crack pipe, it's a destructive euphoria. When other consumers come together and form a consensus, but their consensus is that they are miserable and unfulfilled, and they want to see something innocent harmed. Just to know they can have an effect on literally anything, even if it's a completely evil act. It's the same logic that frat boys use when they come together to commit a gang rape. And the consumers absolutely raped Call of Duty in the same way. Now, instead of satisfying people like me who enjoyed it for what it is, Call of Duty just disappoints its detractors who will never be satisfied by something so insignificant to their whole miserable existence as a computer game. It's like if a leukemia patient on his deathbed yelled at his nurse just to try and make her cry. Being an NPC with no personality is the most destructive force in the world, because if you have a void in your head and you hate your life, then it is a relief to have it filled with insane nonsense. Anyways, the majority of people don't understand the subtext behind Call of Duty's stories. They think it's just a recruitment tool by the United States Armed Forces or stupid action movie slop, which sounds plausible at first but really doesn't hold up to scrutiny. If you actually look at the themes of the stories, the 2007 Modern Warfare is largely apolitical. Well, it's about members of the democratic world order fighting against fascists, so it's more like a re-emergence of the Second World War. But it's not critical of America. But then Modern Warfare 2 is about a high-ranking member of the American government engineering an attack on Americans to social engineer compliance and garner power for himself. Clearly influenced by 9/11 conspiracy theories, the game's foreign terrorist adversary turns out to be insignificant, and the game ends with rogue agents hunting down the American leader through the caves of Afghanistan like he is Osama bin Laden. And because of Shepard's influence, the good guys are labeled as terrorists. If you compare that to actual propaganda like America's Army, there's practically no political context in the games, no hated adversary. It's just showing off stuff about the Army like Javelin missiles and Crows systems. Then in Black Ops, they're talking about MK Ultra, Operation Paperclip, the Bay of Pigs, the Contras. All things you wouldn't want to highlight if you were making propaganda. Before the game moved on to science fiction settings talking about things like the rise of technocrats, information control, and private armies. Even in the fully science fiction Black Ops games, America is evil. So Call of Duty isn't propaganda. It's got ideas behind it, stories, themes, and worlds that they build up. I think the best comparison I could make is that Call of Duty games are like if Metal Gear Solid was written and directed by Americans. By the time Infinite Warfare launched, well over half the sci-fi concepts in Metal Gear Solid had appeared in Call of Duty. Even with the fantastical elements, Call of Duty, like Metal Gear, is grounded in commentary on contemporary and historical events. Even if YouTubers can't squeeze out 8-hour-long videos, like a constipated dog rambling about the games, because it's too subtle for them to catch on, or they don't want to look like a plebeian, for talking about a game series that has sold hundreds of millions of copies instead of tens of millions. Luckily, you have me here to talk about Call of Duty instead. So a quick disclaimer before I finally get to my thesis. When you're writing fiction, you're not going to directly copy elements from history exactly the same unless you're writing historical fiction. So for example, the Galactic Empire is based on Nazi Germany, but Hitler couldn't shoot lightning out of his fingertips like Emperor Palpatine. While there are comparisons to be made with Infinite Warfare and the contemporary world, it's not going to be exact. I'm just going to highlight the similarities here. There are also influences from other historical events too that are mixed into Infinite Warfare. The conflict between the UNSA and SDF were deliberately designed to mirror the American Civil War with the Martians as the Confederates. The attack on Geneva is called Pearl Harbor in some concept art. The economic dependence of the two powers is designed to mirror that of the European Union and Russia, as is the SDF's usage of sleeper cells and hybrid warfare. I've also seen comparisons to the plot of Gundam. The central theme of the game is the burden of leadership, which is much more on the nose than any commentary about Israel. In fact, the most overt reference to anything relating to Israel is the Aeatus guns being compared to the Iron Dome air defense system. Now let's finally get to explaining the title of this video. Israel is the bad guy in Call of Duty, Infinite Warfare. And what I mean by that is that the Settlement Defense Front, the antagonist faction, is based off of Israel. So first off, let's look at their name. It combines two terms familiar to any discussion about Israel. The first is settlements. The Israeli settlements are a sort of sanitary language used to describe what comes after the Israeli government commits ethnic cleansing. When the government or an Israeli militia forces Palestinians off of their land and then moves into their homes, the government calls it a settlement. Following that up with the Defense Front creates the SDF acronym, one letter off from the IDF, Israeli Defense Force, the main mechanism for committing violence, but also calling it the Front instead of Settlement Defense Force implies a connection to leftist political revolution. Israel was founded and governed on socialist collectivist principles. The earliest waves of Israeli settlements were communes, and Zionism itself was a revolutionary political movement. So the idea that Zionism was a populist front actually fits well here. On the other hand, the SDF is at war with the UNSA, the United Nations Space Alliance. This is an evolution of the United Nations, which in our world has consistently been at odds with Israel. Israel is the Western equivalent of a rogue state like North Korea or Belarus, held in the good graces of one permanent Security Council member, while the rest of the world is rightly fed up with their criminal actions. Except instead of Russia or China, it's the United States. Regardless, the United Nations as an entity is opposed to Israel and also signifies the broad unpopularity of the Israeli government. This broad opposition to Zionism is further signified by the wide range of national flags that SATO soldiers wear. Nora Salter, the secondary protagonist of the game, prominently wears a Lebanese flag, a country known for its historical friction with Israel, although I believe this is a reference to her actress Jamie Gray Hyder being Lebanese-American, since there's also a Japanese sailor on board the Retribution portrayed by a Japanese-American actress. Now let's start moving chronologically through the start of the campaign, starting with Reyes's narration. Again, this is not exactly the same as Israel's history and the ideology of Zionism, but there are parallels.
The needs of our planet were greater than she could supply. So we went beyond the reaches of our atmosphere. The new frontier offered the promise of a new beginning. But the distance gave way to a movement with no connection to the place we call home. New rules, new ambitions, a new enemy.
Something I want to note about this first section is that I believe it is speaking more directly on the conditions of the Ashkenazi and the early Zionist movement before Israel was founded. Infinite Warfare is a personal story because the lead writer and the actor who portrays the protagonist Reyes is Brian Bloom, who is an American Jew. American Jews invariably have strong and complicated opinions on Israel and Zionism. I think Brian channeled that into a powerful allegory. Brian is not the only Jewish game developer to channel his feelings about Israel into his game either. Neil Druckmann has been open about how the history of Israel inspired the war in Seattle in The Last of Us. And Ken Levine similarly drew on the Jewish experience when designing the characters in City of Rapture for BioShock. Rapture may have been based off of Galt's Gulch, but the elements he added, Andrew Ryan's anxiety about the world powers, the failure of his utopia, the endless war between neighbors in cramped spaces over limited resources, the extreme inequality and class warfare, were inspired by the history of the Zionist movement. So historically, the Palestine territory that Israel was formed from had been taken from the Ottomans by the British after WWI, mirroring the imperialistic settlement of Mars by the United Nations to gain access to its minerals. The second paragraph about the new frontier refers to the migration of Jewish people to Palestine. Most European Jews experienced a new beginning in Palestine after the horrors they had been subjected to during the Holocaust, not only by the fascists, but also their so-called liberators. The only major Allied power that didn't make it an official policy to discriminate against Jewish people was the United States. Even the United States had men like General Patton who targeted Jewish people. And more concerning is that there were enough under him who accepted his policy for it to still harm Jews, just like how almost all Palestinians have been driven to supporting terrorism. As an act of resistance against Israel after decades of injustice, Jewish people flocked to the Zionist state as an alternative to future atrocity. The SDF movement in this context refers to the failure of Zionists to form a Jewish republic along the lines of Western democracies, instead creating an apartheid state designed to reinforce a system of inequality between people based on ethnicity, especially disappointing many Jews in the wake of the Holocaust.
The Settlement Defense Front built an army and broke away from the earth with blood and violence. They aren't revolutionaries. They want absolute power. They raid colonies, take resources, and control territories by force. They use their fleet to block us from raw materials we need to survive. Their mission is to erase everything Earthborn. Today, the SDF is a war machine, ruled by its military. If a leader united that force, they would mobilize and try to take our homeland.
In supplementary material, it stated the SDF was originally created to enforce martial law to quell violence on early Martian settlements. After the First World War, the British government had strict quotas trickling in Jewish settlers from Europe, leading to tensions and violence with the Palestinians and to the formation of Zionist militias in response. So the SDF's origins exist in parallel to the Zionist movement. Later, after the Second World War, these militias began attacking not just Palestinians but the British as well when Israel declared independence. In violation of any borders that had been established, the Zionists began a campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians. In Infinite Warfare, the SDF's radicalization, their attempts to exert economic influence over Earth and atrocities committed against other Martians, provoked the UNSA to send an occupation force to Mars to keep minerals flowing to Earth and quell the violence until the SDF openly revolted and won the war to gain their independence from Earth. Their victory was also followed by a series of massacres, presumably conducted against politically inconvenient groups on Mars. The specific violent actions mentioned, such as taking resources, mirror the way Israel would steal arable land and water from Palestinians, the constant raids on the Gaza Strip and West Bank, and the settlement system as previously mentioned. Israel's blockade of Gaza is also infamous, as is the objective to eradicate the Palestinians, or as they're called in Infinite Warfare Earthborn. The fact that Israel is a very jingoistic society dominated by its military is no secret either. You can also read ancillary materials about the history of the SDF, where the UN ceded territory over a series of wars to the SDF after they gained independence. As an example, the Moon Titan was originally part of Earth after Mars became independent, but the SDF violated the treaty they signed with the UN, invading and enslaving the colonists that were already living, which is based on the real-world exploitation of Palestinian labor, which is a cornerstone of Israel's economy, along with their policy of ethnic cleansings and settlements, slowly encroaching on Palestinian lands. It's also worth noting what the natural resources of Titan that are also being contested between Earth and Mars are. Titan serves as a major fuel refinery and depot for the SDF. Now, they don't specify what type of fuel they're using, but we can make an educated guess. Titan has a massive amount of methane stored on it, estimated to be at least 40 times more than all hydrocarbons on Earth by volume. The name of the UNSA raid Operation Burn Water implies that the actual refined fuel is hydrogen rather than a hydrocarbon. But even still, splitting hydrogen from methane is actually easier than splitting it from water. Here on Earth, we get our methane is the active ingredient of natural gas. Chemically, it's the same as what you would get on Titan, except with some impurities. So Titan serves as another example of events in game that relate to Israel. At the turn of the millennium, they discovered large deposits of natural gas off the coast of Israel and Gaza. Despite the large natural gas deposits off the coast of Gaza, Israel had intentionally blocked its development to maintain a monopoly on natural gas in the Palestinian territories. In turn, Hamas has attempted to destroy Israeli natural gas infrastructure before, much like Sado during Burnwater. Now, for the first mission of the game, there is a weapons laboratory on Europa where the UNSA is developing a laser beam weapon when it suddenly comes under attack by the SDF, who murder the civilian staff at the base. Now, later on, you learn that the SDF had already developed a similar weapon, but scaled it up to the point that they can use it as a superweapon to destroy UNSA spaceships in a single shot. This is an allegory for Israel and their undeclared weapons of mass destruction compared to their neighbors. Countries like Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Palestine pursue ballistic missiles, chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons as a deterrent against Israeli aggression. While Israel already has those weapons, undeclared and a lot more sophisticated than what their rivals have been able to create. One of the ways the IDF maintain a monopoly on these weapons is by assassinating civilian scientists working for rival governments.
My men need medical.
Take care about your men. Cloud's judgment.
This scene is part of the larger themes of the burden of leadership. But the crass disregard of the lives of their own people by Koch is a reference to the IDF's official policy of killing their own people taken prisoner so they can't be used as leverage. A major shift in the story occurs when Reyes begins to follow Koch's example, ordering the people under his command on suicide attacks. Historically, the first Palestinian suicide attacks began in 1989, 3 years after the Hannibal Directive was introduced by the IDF. Now let's talk about ethnicity. Because the SDF pushes for a single overriding identity for its people, that of Martians. But they come from different backgrounds. Most of the characters have Germanic, Eastern European, or Near Eastern names and backgrounds. Koch, Thais, Der Hachoff, and Ria would fit as surnames for Jews or Gentiles from across Europe and the Middle East. This corresponds to some of the major Jewish ethnic groups. Israelis are split between Ashkenazi, also known as European Jews, and Mizrahi Jews, also known as Asian Jews, as in West Asia. There are a few exceptions to this, with a few SDF characters named after people who worked on the game, who happen to have distinctly non-Jewish names. Also, like Israel, the European people in the SDF generally trend towards the higher positions in their society. The highest ranks in the SDF are all European named, and while the Israeli government wants to merge the Asian and European Jews into a single Israeli people, the reality of that mostly consists of coercing the Mizrahi to abandon their traditions and adopt Ashkenazi culture, or the fake Israeli culture that they manufactured. On the other side of the coin, there are many potentially Jewish surnames among the Unse as well. Reyes is a common Iberian Jewish or Sephardic surname. Adler is a common one amongst Ashkenazi. So the protagonist potentially represents Jewish opposition to Israel. One more character in universe I should briefly mention. Conor McGregor's character Bradley Fillion is an SDF captain under the main antagonist Salen Koch. He is unique in that he was born in Ireland but defected to the SDF. Like the actor portraying him, he has an antisocial personality and gravitated towards the fascist government over his liberal homeland. This reflects the trend of reactionary Jews from Western countries migrating to Israel. Bradley also has a twin brother named Michael, who serves as the chaplain on board the Retribution. No doubt Brian Bloom has experienced firsthand the physical separation of the American Jewish community by Zionism. As friends and family members moved to Israel in response to things like the Civil Rights Act, breaking down the barrier between Black and Jewish communities. The fact the Fillions are twins is not only convenient because it allows them to use McGregor to portray both of them, but it also shows how Zionism drives a wedge between the Jewish community. Even at the smallest scale, two brothers who share the same DNA find themselves diametrically opposed to one another. In fact, Brian has a younger brother named Michael Bloom. He has two, actually. The other one is named Scott. This is just speculation on my part, but it could be that they have divergent opinions on Zionism, or did at one point. They also have a Brito-Celtic identity like the Fillion brothers, though theirs is Scottish rather than Irish. Finally, this is less of a person, but we are introduced to the C6 bipedal robots, a separate class of enemies in Infinite Warfare. The SDF militarized labor bots to supplement their inferior population with autonomous weapons. In the real world, Israel is a pioneer of unmanned combat vehicles, suicide drones and the like, where they militarized what is essentially a flying camera to make a cheaper alternative to conventional missiles. Also, one of the first things you see these bots do is crush a man's skull, which is a recurring tactic Israel uses, most infamously against Rachel Corrie. We also get a good look at the SDF flag. Again, it's not an obvious direct copy, and the color scheme is actually the opposite of the blue and white. But it does follow the emerging triangular patterns of the Star of David. Next up is the attack on Geneva, which occurs during Fleet Week. This is again fitting within the other themes of the game, but it is thematically connected to Zionism. First off, the SDF attack occurred on May 7th. This date holds a more direct connection to the 6 Days War than Fleet Week or Pearl Harbor. If you think about the timeline, the SDF attacked Europa, and then SCAR Team 7 responded and was destroyed 18 hours before the attack on Geneva. So it's possible that Europa was attacked on May 5th, the anniversary of Operation Focus, when Israel launched a surprise attack on Egypt to cripple their air force, preceded invading and occupying Sinai. Also, the 6 Days War began in response to Egypt banning Israeli shipping through the Suez Canal, due to the atrocities Israel was committing against Palestinians. In Infinite Warfare, the SDF attack was in response to the UNSA sanctioning them for their atrocities. Even the design language of the SDF has a lot in common with Israel from this era, specifically military equipment from the Soviet Union and Britain in the 1960s. Britain was a major source of Israeli weapons during the 6 Days War, while after the war the IDF incorporated large numbers of Soviet weapons captured from the nations they attacked. Granted, the only thing that is really obviously drawn from either country is the Folk, which is the Star Wars blaster equivalent of an AK-47. But still, the idea is there. The SDF is also mentioned to make extensive use of captured and reverse-engineered SATO equipment like the IDF. The NV-4, KBAR-32 and Type 2 are all Earthborne designs, while the Volk and R-3K are Martian. And yet the SDF uses all 5 of them. Now let's talk about the death messages. Unlike previous Call of Duty games which use a series of famous quotes, Infinite Warfare's death messages are used to tell us more about the SDF. Okay, so Mars Eternum stands out a bit. It's not really genocidal rhetoric or anything, but I bring it up for a final point I want to make about Israel, which is the Hebrew language itself. The SDF uses Latin for a lot of their naming schemes, which isn't uncommon, but theirs goes a bit farther than Latin phrases on money. The SDF has agencies named in Latin and such. In the same vein, modern Hebrew is a language that was made up as part of the Zionist national identity. The Hebrew language had already gone extinct by the time of the Romans, replaced by Aramaic and by successive languages the Jews adopted such as German, which they developed with their own Yiddish dialect. Logically, since most Jews spoke Arabic when Israel was founded, it would make sense for them to use Arabic as their language. Instead, they created modern Hebrew, which is an inherently ugly language that tries to ignore thousands of years of linguistic change in Jewish history. In order to make a connection to the extinct culture the Zionists are LARPing as, destroying the organic Jewish cultures and languages that they're descended from, and most importantly, driving a wedge between them and their Arabic-speaking neighbors. That's all of the connections between Israel and the SDF I can think of off the top of my head. I hope you understand why I'll never accept Call of Duty as a mindless action game. Let me know what you think of this video in the comments section below, especially if you want to argue with me. Until next time, this has been Divest.